This was an incredibly weighty report from MPs we saw this week, taking in issues across several sectors and really very unhappy with the way the government has approached this over many years. Do you think it was a fair report? Did they get this about right?
Broadly speaking, yes. I think it's been a very valuable wake-up call for the nation. I'd like to say that in addition to being, very substantive, the report is also timely, but unfortunately, it's taken a long time to get out. A lot of water's flowed under the bridge since then, and there have been some steps taken by the government to address some of the concerns raised by the committee. The new National Security Act, which has just come out, for example, that creates updates concepts of espionage and mandates the creation of a register of interests of those representing foreign states. I think that's an important contribution. Also, measures to ensure that mergers and acquisitions in specified areas that are relevant to national security have to be vetted by the government before they go ahead. So I think there are important developments that have taken place since that inquiry was first launched. But the broader points made by the committee's report, I think, stand, and that is about the absence of a clearly defined strategy for dealing with China, and the reality that managing the relationship with China is currently a very fragmented situation amongst different departments and organizations, many of whom lack the skills, background, or expertise effectively to manage the relationship.
It's striking how our views on this have changed in this country. And obviously, when you were at MI6, it was a very different era. And I remember, you'll remember David Cameron, George Osborne talking about this golden era of relations famously with China and how bad that looks now, given how China has acted since then. Did we just get it completely wrong? And are we still slowly trying to change, a whole national perspective, and that just inevitably takes time?
Yeah. Well, I think every nation on the planet, this includes the United States of America, is struggling to balance its economic and security interests when it comes to dealing with China. I think the golden era resulted in the UK going too far in one direction, taking insufficient account of changes in China's attitude to the wider world that were already starting to be evident. That has now come home to roost. China has become more assertive, more aggressive in certain areas. And, I think there was a general failure to recognize the challenge of dealing with a country like China that treats everything as a whole of state, if not whole of nation enterprise. And finds it very easy to exploit the freedoms of an open society such as the United Kingdom. We've been here before with the Soviet Union, but of course the Soviet Union, whilst a military superpower, was not an economic superpower. China is both, and that complicates the situation very significantly.
That's a really interesting point. I think also you talk about exploiting the freedoms of our society. I wonder if they're also exploiting the short-termist approach, as the committee called it. And we do tend to see that from our politicians, don't we? I suspect partly because of the political system that we have, with them always thinking about the next election and winning over voters. And it's hard to get the sort of long-term strategy that I guess you need for dealing with a threat like this.
I guess that's true, and it's certainly something that affects the intelligence and security community, with settlements, lasting typically 3 years. When you're dealing with situations that require significant long-term investment and planning to deal with, and China is a classic example of that. Developing a core of intelligence personnel who speak the language, are familiar with the culture, understand the country, doesn't happen overnight. And 3-year investment cycles funding cycles don't really help.
One of the things flagged by the committee was about China's involvement in our nuclear projects. There's a new site at Bradwell in particular. Would it just be safer and better for the UK now just to make sure China is taken out of all of our nuclear planning, given the obvious national security implications?
Oddly, I feel more relaxed about that than certain other areas where China is deeply embedded in the British state. And I think the nuclear sector, concerns may somewhat be overdone. At the end of the day, if China builds a nuclear power plant, that's our nuclear power plant. It's our power. It can't be diverted elsewhere. And if the contracts are written properly, and mitigation measures put in place, we can deal with the threat of China trying to shut it down or otherwise sabotaging or disrupting its functioning. So I'm less concerned about that. I'm more concerned about some of the business deals, mergers, acquisitions that are taking place and are inadequately policed, and about agreements made by China with local governments and other entities who really lack the knowledge and experience to be able to do this safely.
Why do you think that is, that these mergers and acquisitions have been allowed to take place? The report suggests the business department is just not engaging with this properly, and there's this suggestion that we're putting prosperity above security. Is that essentially the problem?
I think in a sense it has been, but as I mentioned, there are now measures in place to police mergers and acquisitions in 17 key areas that where these might have national security implications. So I think that we're starting to deal with that. As with all these things, it's one thing to put legislation in place. It's another thing to give that legislation teeth and to ensure that the provisions are systematically and energetically implemented. And the UK has a bit of a track record of setting up regulatory agencies and then not really giving them the powers or resources they need.
The other area raised by the committee is higher education, and they talk about the amount of money flowing between China and the UK for research and development and so on. Is that something that concerns you?
Well, I think we are vulnerable. I can think of at least one top-tier Russell Group university in this country that would probably have to declare bankruptcy if it lost its Chinese student cohort. So I think there is a requirement for all educational institutions to think about spreading their risk and not having China as a single point of failure. At the same time, I think we need to guard against creating a climate of Sinophobia in this country. Not every Chinese student who comes to study in the UK wants to be or actually is an agent of China. Potentially they can be. By the same token, not every businessman that wants to invest in the UK sets out to be an agent of China, though the potential is there. It's not necessarily the case. I also think with concern about, for example, Confucian institutes are overdone. And if we, I really don't think we can assume that our young people are so devoid of agency or so intellectually numbed by exposure to vacuous deconstructionist claptrap that they can't exercise their own critical faculties and decide the significance and value of what they're being told.
I was going to ask you, Nigel, about those Confucius Institutes, because some of the concern about them is not just about their sort of influence over students or not. It's about the route that China uses as to sort of get people into the country, to put people in positions of that they maybe wouldn't be in, interplay with politicians, with business leaders. They're hosting technology conferences, for example, at these major universities. Do you think the Prime Minister made the wrong decision or the right one? Because he had originally said he was going to scrap them and then decided to pull back from that.
Well, personally, I think he took the right decision not to do that. In the overall scheme of things, I don't think the Confucius Institutes per se are that much of a concern. There are far more pressing issues that need to be addressed in terms of particularly how China seeks to exercise influence in this country. I mean, I think the important thing is, and the ISC report does this very effectively, is raise awareness of the problem. And once you have an awareness of the problem, you are are already beginning to exercise some degree of deterrence.
And do you think
I think this is starting to happen.
And do you think the Prime Minister has enough of a grip on that? Do you think he cares enough, he sees it enough, he's focused enough on China?
Well, I don't know what he is being told by his intelligence community, but I imagine that they are briefing him on a regular basis. I think Ken McCallum, as the Director General of MI5, has been pretty vocal and active in raising awareness of the threat. And I know that his colleagues in SIS and GCHQ are similarly attuned to it. So I imagine he is being kept up to speed on developments.
And Nigel, just finally, we've heard this morning that the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, is going to be stepping down at the next reshuffle ahead of stepping down from Parliament. It's a blow, isn't it, for the UK to be losing such a high-profile and respected military leader, essentially, at a time of war in Europe?
Well, I can't really comment on sort of individual politicians' decisions or appointments. So obviously, some degree of continuity is always desirable, but given our political system, I think it's perhaps unsurprising. These ministerial jobs are very demanding, very wearing, and I think there is sufficient continuity in the system generally that we shouldn't be induced to panic about a decision like this.
All right,
you're right. Ben Wallace has been a very effective defense secretary, clearly.
That's reassuring. I just want to ask you very lastly on China. I feel like with Russia, people see, the war in Ukraine. They see Vladimir Putin going on TV talking about nuclear weapons. The risk and the threat seems very real. With China, it feels a bit more nebulous. It's quite hard to understand what all the sort of the creep of Chinese intelligence really means for people. Can you crystallize what the single biggest risk we face from China is in the next 5 years that you worry about, and is something that people might tangibly see that they should be concerned about?
I don't think there is a single issue that I would identify coming up in the next 5 years. It's more the insidious impact of the totality of Chinese activities in a country like the UK that we have to worry about. I mean, obviously, the one thing that potentially could be problematic for everybody is if there were to be an incident in the Taiwan Strait that escalated out of control and led to full-scale hostilities between China, the USA, and allies. That would be undoubtedly a game-changing contingency. I think it unlikely, but it's not one that can be ruled out.